On February 1st, 1994, after releasing 2 independent albums, Green Day was about to bring punk to the mainstream, and in a few short years, it would spark a pop-punk revolution. The album? Dookie. Hey, I'm Jade, and this is Backline Beat's Turn It Up Tuesday, where I give a little bit of history to albums of the past. Before we get into this album, this might actually be the album of which I have kind of the most history myself with. It's not my favorite album I've done of one of these, but it's definitely the one that's been around the longest. It's one of the first albums I remember having as a kid. I didn't have a lot of like CDs or cassettes when I was a kid. I had just kind of a few that were in a constant rotation, and this was one of them. But enough about me. This is about Green Day and their album Dookie, so let's get into the album. The California band themselves consists of Billy Joe Armstrong on vocals and guitar, Trey Cool behind the drums, and Mike Durst on the bass. And even though this was the band's 3rd album, they were all still just 21 at the time, which is kind of crazy to think about. While being on the independent label Lookout for their first 2 albums, the band spawned a major label bidding war for their 3rd. And while they met with the major labels, they couldn't click with one of them. Really, they just didn't want to be a label band. They thought the label would just turn them into kind of like the next Nirvana, the punk Nirvana, and they would kind of lose a bit of themselves. After meeting with Rob Cavallo of Reprise, which was a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, they just clicked, and Cavallo even kind of jammed with the band on their meeting, and so they ended up signing with Reprise, with Cavallo set to produce their 3rd album. Though signing with Reprise didn't come without its backlash. See, they were immediately deemed sellouts, as many artists and musicians are once they get successful or sign with a major label. And especially this is true in the punk movement. And, you know, the band just felt that they couldn't ever return to kind of the punk underground, to kind of the punk ethos at its core after the backlash. There was no turning back for the band and the genre as a whole after this album. The new era of punk started in September 1993 when Green Day entered Fantasy Studios in Berkeley, California. All the songs were already written going into the studio, with Green Day having rehearsed to make sure they could make most of their recording time. See, they were used to having no time and no money going into making an album. So with that time and money that they were now afforded, they wanted to make the most of it. Even being really prepared, after the initial session and mix were done, they weren't happy, so they ended up remixing it and getting it to the point of which they liked. One of the songs they actually re-recorded, and that was Welcome to Paradise, which had originally been on their album Kerplunk. And a new song that they wrote for this album that didn't make the cut was Good Riddance, Time of Your Life, which of course itself ended up on an album later on. The album itself is mostly about Armstrong's self-discovery, him trying to figure out his anxiety and his panic disorders and his struggle with his bisexuality, among other things that didn't directly relate to him, but just the world as a whole. He used the songs to get an understanding of himself. That's the one way he could get that understanding, was to write about them, using the songs' kind of characters to work through things. And in turn, that obviously connected with the audience. It wasn't just all Armstrong behind the mic. Trey Cool has a hidden track on the last song of the album where he plays guitar and sings. As for the name itself, it was originally called Liquid Dookie, as in reference to the band's bowel movements while they were on tour. They didn't have a good diet, they ate like crap, and thus had a lot of liquid dookie. But that was a bit too graphic for the head label Warner's, so they shortened it to Dookie. The label allowed it, and here we are. The cover of the album might just be as iconic as the tracks within. The artist Richie Butcher's illustration is a reference to Berkeley's Telegraph Avenue, and the band really wanted just little references to themselves and the area and their influences and such. Some of the figures on the album cover include the likes of Patti Smith shaving her armpit, Angus Young, the woman on the front of the first Black Sabbath album, and the man holding the camera was a reference to a photographer who used to shoot all the bands on weekends at Gilman's. But if Warner's actually had their way, it would have just been a picture of the band on the album. Good thing they didn't listen. After all of this was finished, it's time for Dookie to be released. While Cavallo hoped that the band would be able to sell 200,000 copies, Tré Cool was a bit more optimistic, thinking 500,000. Boy, were they both way, way, way off. With an initial run of only 9,000 copies, it sold out immediately, which then caused a bit of an issue with the actual selling speed of the album due to expectations and demand. They had some time catching up, but by June they had surpassed Cavallo's 200,000 and reached Tré Cool's 500,000. Critically, Dookie was acclaimed, with critics liking the polished punk that still maintained some attitude. It towed the line between not giving a shit while still caring. This became another layer of the youth movement, giving a lighter offering to that coming out of the grunge and rock scene. It was bringing the fun back to rock. As the album grew, so did the size of the audiences. Armstrong has said, "I loved watching the crowds getting bigger and bigger, the excitement of people singing every word." Before we get into the singles, if you like what you see so far, I'd love if you hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel a lot, especially a small growing one like this. Thanks. Now let's get back into it.
I'll sit around and watch the tube, but nothing's on.
The first single was Longview. It was released the same day as the album, and it's named after Longview, Washington. It peaked at #1 on the alternative airplay charts, and the bass line of the song was written by Dernstwall on LSD. This was actually Green Day's first music video. It was directed by Mark Core, who would become a frequent collaborator. It was shot in the band's apartment, with Core painting the walls to make it more interesting and allowing the band to pop from the background, specifically Armstrong. Longview ended up scoring a Grammy nomination for Best Hard Rock Song. Next up,
Do you have the time to listen to me whine about nothing and
Basket Case was released on August 1st, 1994, becoming an instant classic. The song reached #1 on the alt-rock charts, where it stayed for 5 weeks. For this song, Armstrong wanted this listener to be challenged by the lyrics and its subject matter. Not only is it about his anxiety and panic disorders, it's also about his struggle with his sexuality, saying it's not as black and white as you think. As for the video, Core was back, and instead of shooting in the band's apartment, at their request, they shot at Agnew's Developmental Center in California, which was an abandoned mental institution. It took heavy influence from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Like Heart-Shaped Box, of which you can actually see in Utero's album history here, they shot it on black and white and then colored it in post. It was this song that really influenced and spurred the later pop-punk movement, though the band doesn't really care for the term pop-punk. This song too scored a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Vocal Performance by a Duo or Group. Third up was Welcome to Paradise, which was released on October 17th, 1994. The song was written as a concept as a letter to Armstrong's mom. The band had moved into an abandoned building and was living with a whole host of people from all walks of life. And the song is kind of a letter to someone, kind of updating them of where they are. Tré Cool actually wrote the guitar riffs for the song while Armstrong took up the drums. The video was actually just live footage from a performance they did on the day the album came out. Last up was When I Come Around. Released to radio in December 1994. It wasn't officially released until January 31st, 1995. By official, I mean the music video, as there was no actually physical releases of the singles for this album in the US, as the label wanted the focus to be on people buying the album themselves, which I think they got right. The band had been playing the song for years before actually recording it, and the song ended up being their most successful from the album. While maybe not critically, it definitely numerically topped the modern rock charts for 7 straight weeks and hit the top 10 in multiple countries. It's also the 19th most successful song on the modern rock / alternative airplay charts as of 2023. The song itself is about Armstrong's relationship with his long-distance girlfriend when they were teenagers. It ended up working out, and they ended up getting married not long after Dookie hit the shelves. Once again, the video was directed by Core and features the band walking through the streets and areas and featuring a cast of characters intercut throughout, including their touring guitarist Jason White and his girlfriend. On MTV, the channel played both that video and the live footage from the infamous Woodstock 94 performance where the band got into a mud fight with the crowd. In conclusion, the album gave way for punk to enter the mainstream, influencing and making way for the surge of pop-punk bands that would come later, such as Blink-182, Sum 41, Simple Plan, and more, that carved themselves out a spot on the airwaves. I'm not sure anyone would have predicted the influence that the punk rockers from California and their third album would have on the music world. But 30 years and over 20 million copies later, it's still being felt today. So grab it off your shelves or open your favorite music app and turn up this week's album, Green Day's Dookie. Thanks, I hope you liked it, and I'd love if you subscribed and left a comment on who you would like to see me feature at a later date. Also, I'd love if you headed over to backlinebeat.com and checked out what I have over there. It's mostly concert photos and cool stuff like that. And I have a lot of cool stuff planned for 2024, and I'd love for you to be part of that journey. And if you would, and you'd like to support the channel a little bit more and can, I have links of how you can do so below, and I'd be very grateful. If not, just like I said, subscribe. And yeah, thanks, and have yourself a good one.